Welcome to the Today Counts show. Today does count because it impacts, it influences your tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. The Today Counts podcast is sponsored by the generous donors of the Lead Today community. I'm your host, Tim Piper. Okay, I have with me today on the Today Counts show, General Jerry Boykin, a dear friend, and somebody who hopefully can help us bring some clarity to what is going on right now over in Israel. So without further ado, General Boykin, I'm just going to ask you to bring us up to speed, and I'll bug you with questions as we go through it. So what's going on? What should we know?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for having me on this program, and I've enjoyed being with you before. So, listen, this is probably one of the most brutal things that I have seen or heard of, and I've been in some bad places, and I think this probably is the worst that I've ever seen. And I must tell you, Jim, and I don't want to be considered a fanatic, but this is a diabolical. I mean, it is just pure evil. And if people don't believe that there's both good and evil, then all you have to do is look at what these people have done to the Israelis and their babies and their wives and the old people. It's terrible. Now, the first thing that everybody talks about is the surprise. How could they have been surprised like this? And I will tell you, Jim, that I lived in Akko, which is up on the northern coast there. I lived there with the Golani Brigade for a period of time, and I got to know them very well, and I got to serve, at least train with, I should say, probably their intel services. And their intel services, when I was with them, and I learned a great deal about them, but they were the best in the world. I mean, it was a matter of, survival for them to have the wherewithal and certainly the determination to keep that country safe. And their intel was probably the thing that they relied on most. And then we see this and we say, how could this have happened? And here's my answer to it. I think that the turmoil that we see in the Knesset today, and the people going after Bibi Netanyahu and all these different political parties here, squabbling and all the stuff with the Supreme Court that has caused so much friction within that country. I think they took their eye off the ball. They got so focused on this stuff, the squabbling and the fighting inside Israel, that I think they just took their eye off the ball, and it cost them. And let me tell you that this was not something that they put together overnight. This is something that has been in the planning for a long time. And we know that they had a pretty good level of secrecy about this, because they didn't even know exactly what they were doing, what they were going to do. They just knew that they were going to be involved in a big operation, and that operation was going to be something that was going to be spectacular. But they didn't know what they were doing. And some of those people that went in by powered hang gliders, which is, if you think about it, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And they didn't know until they were told and taught how to fly a hang glider in a matter of a few hours. They didn't know what they were going to do. And so they have kept a very good lid on this thing. And everybody is second guessing the Israelis now on this, but now is not the time for that. Now is the time for everybody to get in behind Israel, stand firm with Israel, and then do the postmortem when the time is right, so they don't make the same mistake again in the future. But this is going to be a nasty war, Jim. I mean, it already is. Just what they've done already is obviously makes this probably one of the nastiest wars that we've ever seen over in that part of the world. and more than the Gulf War, as a matter of fact. So, what I would say is that there are so many people right now that are coming back to Israel to fight for the nation. It's really something that warms your heart when you see these people coming back, running to the fire, not away from it. They're running to the fire. And, the Israelis and a lot of other people say, well, what they want to do, what the Hamas wants to do, is they want to destroy Israel. But I say this, yeah, they certainly do want to destroy Israel. But is that what this is about? No, because they don't have the wherewithal to destroy Israel. They killed a lot of Jews. But just think about it. Well, how do you destroy Israel? I mean, how do you destroy Israel? A nuclear weapon? That would do it. But thank God they don't have that yet. I think at this point, what they're trying to do is unify the rest of the Arab world.
Right.
What they want to do is they want to get the Israelis to do exactly what they're doing.
Right.
So that pretty quickly everybody forgets what Hamas did. And you look at these universities, for example, these kids have no idea. They have no idea what the Jews are going through. They have no idea what the Jews have put up with since 1948 when they declared sovereignty. So what they're trying to do now is they're trying to unify these other Arab states. And if they could unify these Arab states, they could go in there and in some period of time, they could wipe Israel out.
So they're trying to glue their big brothers to the fight for the ultimate objective that you were talking about before. Let me ask you a couple other questions, just in the sake of background. For those that are not familiar with the geographical uniqueness, and in this case, therefore, some of the problems that Israel faces, could you talk about that? Where is Israel located, and what is it surrounded by, and why is that significant in the what seems to be a never-ending conflict?
Well, first of all, Israel is one of the smallest countries in the world.
Yeah.
And they are not all Jews, by the way. There are Muslims who live inside of Israel that are not part of this. They don't want any part of this because they have a good life living inside of Israel. Now, a lot of people like to talk about the West Bank and Gaza. Well, the reality is this. The West Bank is called Judea and Samaria. It is still covenant land. And I don't want to get too far into the politics of this, but it's covenant land that is Jewish land. And they have ceded a good portion of that to what we call the Palestinians. And by the way, remember that the Jews were called Palestinians. So what is a Palestinian? If we could settle that issue, it might go a long ways to help with this whole thing. But that said, in 1948, when they declared sovereignty, they fought a war immediately. Immediately. I'm talking about within a day. They were being harassed initially, and then an all-out war broke out, and the Jews had to fight just to keep this new nation that they had just created only days before. And that war went on for several months. And oh, by the way, their first general, when they became the IDF and not the Haganah, their first general was an American. His name was Mickey Marcus. So Mickey Marcus had fought in World War II with the U.S. Army, and Mickey Marcus today is the only man buried at West Point who fought dying for another nation. Mickey Marcus was killed over there, but he went over to help them, to train them, and to lead them when that war started. And then we had more wars to include 56, 67, 73. And then you had a series of wars up in South Lebanon and all that. But they have fought against as many as 5 nations at a time. They're bordered by Jordan. They're bordered by Lebanon. They're bordered by Syria. They're bordered by Egypt. And all of those are enemies.
Mm-hmm.
They're all enemies. Now, that said, Jordan has made a peace treaty with them, and Egypt did when Anwar Sadat actually went over there. Cost him his life. He was eventually killed because of that, because the other Arab nations were so angry and upset that Anwar Sadat went to Israel that ultimately they killed him. They killed Anwar Sadat. So that cost him a lot. And then you look at the fact that Israel, when they fought the first war, they were using airplanes that were nothing but Piper Cubs.
Hmm.
And there are stories from the Yom Kippur War, which was in 73, and it occurred mostly up on the Golan Heights, but there was also fighting down on the border with Egypt also. But when they fought that fight, there is story after story of miraculous things that occurred during that war. In a natural sense, no one could fathom that the Israelis were going to be able to withstand the 5-nation attack that occurred. But that's exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I was just talking to a woman that was living in Israel, and there are stories about 2 tanks taking on a company of Egyptian tanks, or a company of armored personnel carriers were taking on multiple enemy vehicles and enemy weapon systems and so forth. And then there's the one of Ariel Sharon, who crossed the Suez Canal and got in the middle of the formation of the Egyptians, and they turned around and took off back to Cairo. Hmm. And there's other stories where some of those that were captured, some of the people from the 5 countries that were captured, actually saw what they considered to be angels or warriors that were fighting for the Israelis, and they turned and went back to their homes. So what does all of that mean? To me, it means that God has made a promise that the Israelis will never be defeated again. And I think that the beginning, and I don't want to get into the spiritual side of this thing too much, but I do want to say that the Bible is pretty clear in terms of once they started this process of returning to Israel, to the covenant land, to the promised land, I think there's a promise in the Bible that says that they'll never be defeated again. They're not going to be defeated.
Well, if I could speak to that just a little bit, and then what I'd like to do is get a better understanding of the history of Hamas. But before we go to the history of Hamas, which I'm sure you can color that in, naturally, like a lot of Americans, I have heard different sound bites. I've read a few things, but I'm interested in how you would describe it. But from a spiritual perspective, and I know this isn't always received, at face value, and I understand that from any kind of a skeptical, mindset. But from a high level, if we believe that God, created this real thing called the Garden of Eden, which of course is not too far from the area in which we're talking about. At least that's what we think. And the first 4 words that were spoken against God at that time was that, did God really say? And then of course that opened up a dialogue of doubt, and then our rebellion, if you will, to our Creator. Now, some people think this is folklore, but if we just continue on the idea here, and then what we have is, after God cleanses and begins a restart, he finds Abram and his wife Sarah, and he makes a promise to them that basically he was going to rebuild the world through them, putting it in street terms today. And even though they were aged, they were beyond the years of childbearing, that they were going to give him a son. And through that son, the world would be blessed. And of course, like a lot of us, God was taking too long. And so Abram and Sarah took it upon themselves and brought Hagar, one of the servant girls, into it. Abram and Hagar got hooked up, as they say today, and they had a child. In other words, they did the work for God, and his name was Ishmael. But as God promised, he did come through, and Isaac was born to Abram and Sarah sometime later. And of course, there was bickering and fighting in that house because we had two moms, two kids from two different moms. One was the promised one by God, the other one a mistake by man. And I don't believe in mistakes necessarily, but certainly man's mistake. And so they were cast out. And then there is an odd text where God visits Hagar as she's been cast out, and she's wondering if her and her son are just going to die of starvation or thirst or whatever. And God visits, says that's not going to happen. But then he says something that is troubling. God says something that's troubling. He said that basically Ishmael will be a jackass. And in the old language, that was literally the English translation. And then explain what that meant is that he would be hard to get along with, and he would be at war, if you will, with his family. In seminary, we studied that kind of stuff, and it's not real clear. It doesn't seem to be a curse. It just seems to be a prophecy of, what happens when even good men do unfaithful things, and what can be a result of that. And it doesn't make anything right about the Arab world. But I think that every nation, I could be wrong, but I think about every significant nation can probably have their tales of woe. They have their tales of being mistreated, attacked, persecuted. But when you think about the history of Israel, the aggression against them consistently, over and over and over again, would not even the person who does not think of themselves as religious or spiritual begin to wonder about this quick story that I just told that is laid out in Scripture? And of course, I've left out a lot of detail, and here we are again, right? Here we are again. And my wife and I were talking today when we were just listening to the updates, and I, being that I work with leaders around the country, I look at how leaders have been shaped, and I think a nation like Israel can be shaped to where, when you think about the Holocaust, when you think about the wars that you referred to, and you pretty much said, it's kind of like they're saying enough is enough. And when you've been burned in life, when you've been wounded in life, it's a natural thing to be on guard, for that. To your point about their amazing ability in the area of intelligence and security, well, that kind of makes sense to me. It's almost like they're always looking over their back. And I agree with you, and I will say this very, very boldly. I've been disappointed, almost like in myself in some ways, because I've seen on social media some of these young people who are not necessarily young anymore. They're in their 30s and some are 40s, but when I was pastoring, they were young. And to see the things that they're posting on social media, and I don't want to appear as arrogant, because I don't think I'm being arrogant about this. I think that I'm also scratching my head and asking God, why so much conflict? On one hand, I know why, because he told us in the Bible why. On the other hand, we're going, man, come on, there's a paradox here where we're just going, why can't we, figure this out? And so anyway, I've seen these social media posts, and I'm just burdened in my heart. People even underneath my leadership that were younger, I'm saying, man, sometimes as Americans, and I'm not trying to beat us up, but in our worst of days, we have it really good. And I just think that sometimes we don't want to look at reality. We don't want to look at, a perspective of what is real. And again, not to be an alarmist, but what would it take for this to turn into the next world war? Wouldn't it just take one more superpower that is on the opposite side of this issue to step in? then what would happen? And maybe that's why there's some of the hesitations that I'm hearing. That was my sermonette that I just had to get out. Listening to you explain this, but before we dive in more, tell us about Hamas. Where'd they come from? Who are they? I understand their role in Gaza, but how did they come to that place? What's your understanding of their origins?
Yeah, well, back in the 60s is when this whole thing of Islamic terrorism became such an incredible threat to so many nations as well as to so many individuals also. And Hamas really kind of sprang up in the Gaza Strip. Now, the Gaza Strip has Hamas. Judea and Samaria have another group that was created by Yasser Arafat, for the most part, the founder of Fatah. And the organization sprang out of the Gaza Strip. But keep in mind that the Gaza Strip, it's only been 17 years since the Gaza Strip was turned back over by Ariel Sharon to the Arabs, to the Muslims. And from that point on, it got really bad because that gave them an opportunity with no Israeli police or military in that area. It gave them an opportunity to set themselves up with rockets and mortars and all kinds of weapons that all they had to do was get close to the border and they could shoot these into Israel. So it's an organization that is hard to pinpoint its origins. But that said, we do know that it existed before the Gaza Strip was actually turned back over to them. It was an organization that existed, and it was basically coming out of 1948. It had a number of different names, and they have changed, but it was there to try and defeat, kill as many of the Israelis as they possibly could. And that's still their ambition today, as we talked about earlier, is to destroy Israel. But they can't do it, and they know they can't do it. And I think it's important for us to remember right now, the only one that can help them, that would help them right now, is Iran. And I mean help them by giving them a nuclear weapon. So how close is Iran to having a nuclear weapon itself? Very close, very close. And they've got the warheads. What they've been struggling with is being able to deliver those warheads. And that's one of their problems. So I tell you this, because people have got to come to grips with this. There's going to be a ground war. We are way beyond any notion that the Israelis are going to provide a proportionate response. No, they're not going to do that. And anybody that says to them, to include our politicians, whichever side they might be on, that says, no, we need to de-escalate. We need to stop and take a time out. And, well, that's time out is just long enough for them to kill more Jews. They are not going to do that. They've had it. They've had it. This was so brutal that they're not going to have it. And I lived over there, as I said earlier, and I was right up next to the border, right on the coast and the border. And you would get mortar fire, you'd get rockets, you'd get all kinds of weapons being shot at you. And that has just continued. And whenever something like this happens, who winds up being blamed for it?
Right.
And that's what's going to happen here. Even those who have said that they stand with Israel, they're going to tire. They're going to start wanting to see peace. They're not going to want to see that part of the world fighting, as Christians are. Christians will be the same way. That many Christians will think that it would be appropriate now each side has killed somebody, and so now it's time to de-escalate and let's get this war over with and let's get back together and all do well. And anybody that thinks that way just does not understand what they're up against. They don't understand the issue that the Israelis are living with, and they certainly don't understand the mentality of these suicidal demons, and that's what they are. And I will tell you something, Jim, and I said this on a program the other day, so I'm going to say it here to your audience, and that is, I was in a meeting with President Al-Sisi. This has been about 4 years ago. He said to me and all the group there, we had Tony Perkins and Michelle Bachmann and Joel Rosenberg and others, that we went in to see him for a 30-minute meeting. We stayed 3 hours, but one of the things he said to us was, he said, General, you need to understand that the Iranians have a bloodlust. And he said, the president of Turkey is just like him. They both have a bloodlust. And in fact, he said what they want, what al-Sisi wants, is he wants two things. He wants to build a caliphate. And number two, he wants to be the caliph. And as for the Iranians, he said they have a bloodlust. They have a suicide commitment. And he said, and you, talking about America, you just gave them exactly what they need to see that blood trust through. And he was talking about the JCPOA or the Iran deal. And he really didn't hold back in terms of how he thought that JCPOA was ultimately going to really come back and hurt the United States along with many other countries, because we were giving them something that they actually have an inclination to use it. And that is because if they fire a nuclear weapon and they kill 8 or 9 million Jews, which Hitler couldn't even come close to that in 6 years, and they could do it in about 6 seconds. But he was cautioning us that if we don't watch this, that ultimately it's going to throw the whole world into upheaval. And there are no winners. When they start firing nuclear weapons, there's no winners. This, make no mistake, at the center of this is Iran. Iran is the one that started it. And all this stuff about, no, the money that we gave them, the $6 billion that we gave them, has not been touched. Well, first of all, nobody that I know is that stupid to think that they couldn't give them money that could be replaced out of that $6 billion. But they proudly say, well, that money hasn't been touched yet. And I think John Kirby might have backed away from that.
The leadership, and I've heard it from more than one, of Israel has said, and I quote, Hamas is ISIS. What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely. I agree with that. And that's because they are joined by a common theology.
Yeah.
Theology is Islam. Yeah, what's interesting is Hamas is Sunni, and most of the groups, I guess about probably 80% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni, not Shia. But the Iranians actually feed both sides. Most of Iran is Shia.
Yeah, so a common enemy creates friends, is the ideology, at least for a while, until it's a standoff between those, right? It's just a constant reduction, and the idea is a reductionist idea, I guess, until you reign supreme. I've also heard that the Gaza Strip has, a couple million people, and they say that many of them are refugees. That seems like a pretty dense population for that. Is it, or is it not? And what do they mean by these refugees?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask them.
Right.
I think what they are trying to do is convince us that the Jews displaced the Muslims, and they are poor people that don't have a home, don't have a homeland. And of course, that was not an issue when the Jews didn't have a homeland. That's what they're talking about. They want the world's sympathy for these people.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, they call them refugees. But again, what is a Palestinian? Up until, I guess it was officially probably in 48, where the Israelis became Israelis. But the Jews, for a long time, had been Palestinians. That's what they were called. In fact, as I was growing up, I didn't even understand what a Palestinian was or where Palestine was until I got in college and the professor said, find Palestine on the map. Oh, it's not there.
Yeah, I even remember in high school, Time Magazine, different media, as I was, just a young boy trying to understand the world. I would say that I heard more than a dozen times that region referred to as the Christians. I've even heard, that terminology. And so then you hear about, Jews and the Christians. So as a Christian, I'm going, it was confusing. Of course, I don't hear that much anymore, but as you said, Palestinians, just like, it's kind of like going back to the war that Israel had with the Philistines. The Philistines don't even exist anymore. Now that's a term that we use for culturalist, logicless, peoples. It's no longer, a group. So it is confusing, I think, because shame to us, we don't pay attention to everything that's going on there every day. And then when it comes fast and furious. And a lot of sound bites are dropped, here and there, and people get confused. And I think that's the reason why, I brought you on the podcast today, just so that we can have a conversation about this and try to understand it. Here's another question for you. And I think a lot of well-meaning Americans, particularly, I know this is going to sound, again, this can sound very arrogant, and I don't mean to be that way, but I don't think I liked going to Sunday school a lot as a kid, but man, was that a good thing, going to Sunday school as a kid. The biblical education and the worldview that you attain, and then when you go to seminary and they actually teach you how to think, they teach you critical thinking, how to argue with the text. They expand your way of thinking. You got to be mentally tough when you go through seminary, in my opinion, unless you're just somebody who believes anything that you hear. And I'm not one of those guys. I was always the pain in the Sunday school teacher's butt, where I'd say, "Why? How do you know? Why? How do you know?" And a lot of people have grown up in this so-called Christian nation, which might still be Christian in the sense of general Christian overtones or cultural overtones, but we already know that at least how we viewed it, many, many moons ago is not what it is today. That's not meant to be a dark or negative statement. I'm just laying a foundation for a question here. So I think that a lot of people who want to believe in God, who maybe even think they believe in God, and maybe even call themselves Christians, but haven't had the benefit of growing up walking through the scriptures, learning the story of God, the story of life here on planet Earth, they get confused. So when we talk about borders protecting our country, some feel that, we don't care about the rest of the world, and that becomes their theology, which, all that's not bad. And then you take the confusion about, Israel having to protect itself. I think this is true. I think I just saw something through one of the news medias that Israel is dropping flyers through the Gaza Strip warning all the residents to take shelter because they're coming. Who does that, right? Who does that? Who doesn't care about people? But there's, I don't think naivety is a bad word. I don't think I'm calling people names to say that they're naive. I know that I'm naive in many things and still am. I try to, understand and deal with that. And then, of course, you get those old bumper stickers. See, how does that go? It basically gives an idea, we can all just get along. And, that's about the most naive thing that I've ever seen. And, people are going to, of course, say, what makes you right, Jim, and everybody else wrong? Well, it's kind of basic common sense, really. Let's set aside who's right or wrong for a minute. But it's only logical that all of those religions can't be right because they're not saying the same thing. And so all of them, but maybe one, but they can't they can't all be right. So you have served our country all the way from boot camp. You played football, boot camp. I mean, I know your story. Part of the Delta Force, serving as a general in our service, lived and been all around the world. And you're a Christian. You're somebody who follows Jesus. You read the scripture. You speak of it often. You preach about it. And sometimes the problem with preaching is that if we're preaching to a crowd that doesn't have a base knowledge, it's almost like we're speaking a foreign language. And so we rely upon God to open up the hearts and the minds and to convict where they say, oh, this is really right. So please share for a couple minutes. Help us understand, because part of being a human is you don't want to see other humans destroyed. And for some, it's hard to call themselves Christian and put up walls to protect us from people coming into our country. When you're there and you see a family that's in need, well, as a human, of course, you're concerned about that family. But you know where I'm going. You're a general. You've had to think in big picture ideas while at the same time holding in tension. What do you do with this little boy that's right in front of you and everything in between?
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the fundamental question, and that is, did the Bible say, thou shalt not kill? And I think that by this time, most Christians understand that it was murder, different thing altogether. Because I've been asked all my life, how can you be in the military and be a Christian at the same time? What do you mean? I say, well, you know what the Bible says. I said, no, I don't think you know what the Bible says.
Right.
Because if you do think that the Bible said thou shalt not kill, then you also have to believe that somewhere between Mount Sinai and the Jordan River, God changed his mind.
Yeah.
Because he said what? He said, kill them all.
Yeah.
Kill them all.
Do not leave one.
That does not mean that you do it with anger. It means that there are such things as righteous wars. And we have so many people that don't really know what the Bible says, or many more that don't care. But you have to reconcile these things with yourself. And you have to understand that when you are engaged in a righteous war, and there is such a thing, then what you do should never be done with malice aforethought. It should be, you do this because that's the enemy. And you either take that enemy out, or that enemy is going to come and get you and your family. And that's what the Jews are up against. They're up against that because those kids that got their heads cut off were just that, they were kids.
Yeah.
And they were brutally, demonically killed. And to me, I can't come to grips with that. I cannot come to grips with it. And I feel now would not be a good time for me to go into battle, because I'm not sure that I could maintain the right attitude because of what has happened there. And I've seen atrocities, but I've never seen anything like this.
Yeah.
And I think that these high school kids and these college kids that are out there protesting against Israel, those are the ones that have not been taught to think for themselves. Those are the ones that will follow along down a dark alley with somebody that they look up to just because this person seems to be a little smarter, or this person seems to be able to persuade other people. And that's exactly what they're doing now. They're persuading these college kids that the real demons here are the Israelites. And they're still Israelites to me. And if you go through life like that, your life ultimately is going to come to a miserable end. That's just fact. Come to a miserable end, one way or the other. You may wind up shooting yourself just because suddenly the light will come on and you'll realize that you haven't been thinking for yourself. You realize that you can't let these kinds of things happen without some effort to stop it. And that's where the Israelis are right now. And they're going into the Gaza Strip. And I was talking to a group of Jews a couple of days ago, and I finally said to them, I said, you're going into the Gaza Strip, and you've been there before 5 or 6 times, and you're going in there and you're going to take the fight to them, and there's going to be a lot of them killed. But what you got to do before you go in there is you got to reconcile to yourself. How, and there's an imperative for you to do this. Just make sure that you do everything you can not to harm those that are innocent. But inevitably, there are going to be people that are going to be killed that want no part of this fight, that had nothing to do with it, but they're still going to get killed because they are in an environment that is no longer going to be allowed by the Israelis to continue doing what they've been doing for years. And I wish people did have the critical thinking skills that are required for something this complex, because they're going to go into Gaza. They're going to be there for quite a while. And there are a lot of people that are going to be killed. But I'll tell you, I saw something one time that really, really touched my heart, really. The Israelis, when I was over there, the Israelis got a tip that there was a big house in Gaza that was an ammunition and weapons cache, and all kinds of weapons, all kinds of ammunition and explosives. So the Israelis called them on the phone. They called the house. They know who owns every house in there. They called them and they said, "Get out. We're getting ready to bomb them." And you know what they did? The Arabs ran up and got on the roof because they knew that they were being watched from the sky. They got up on the roof thinking that, well, now what are you going to do, big boy? And what they did is they came in with a helicopter and they fired over in one corner of the roof. You know, they're flat roofs. One corner of the roof. They fired it right down on that. And that's when the Arabs decided, no, I think these people are serious about this. We're getting out of here. And they took off running just as they released the bomb. And I'm telling you, it was unbelievable how much explosives was in that place. But that's the kind of thing that they do to avoid collateral damage to the extent that they can. They've played this game before, and they know that the world is going to condemn them. If you kill somebody's cat, they're going to get criticized. So when I see people condemning the Jews, and my children are Jews, aside from that, I lived over there with them, and I lost probably one of my best friends ever was killed over there. And I get so angry when I hear people condemning the Jews because you don't know what living up there is like. You can get hit any night. And when I was up in Akko, there were firefights on and off just about every night somewhere. Somebody was firing a rocket or a mortar or something. How would you like to live that way? I mean, just think about it. How would you like to live that way? Or how would you like to send your kids out to get on the school bus and have the bus blown up and killed your kids? So,
when's the last time you've been to Israel?
A couple of years. I'm actually leading a group to the battle sites in a few months.
Yeah, we're supposed to go in September, so we'll see how things develop.
Yeah. Well, this will be different because we're just going to see the battle sites and give them a walkthrough of how the battle, unfolded and so forth. So I think that will be, we're only taking 50 people, but I think that will be a really good education for them if we can get the right people and get them to start spreading this understanding,
right,
biblical worldview. But it's all about the battles.
Yeah, I guess our prayer is that it would at least make people curious to dive down deeper into history, into hopefully the Bible, and maybe the gospel of Christ will make more sense to people and how important blood is. And as morbid as that sounds, we're not nearly as sophisticated as a human race as some think we are. We can take steps back pretty fast into a very barbaric manner. Thank you so much, General Boykin, for, just getting on a call so fast. I texted you yesterday. You responded. Really appreciate it. I asked you because our listeners often say, "Hey, Jim, when are you getting that general back on?" We like listening to him. So wanted to make sure that we did that. And hope you have a good evening.
Okay, Jim. Thanks for having me on. It's been my privilege to be with you, too.
If you're not part of the Lead Today community, let me invite you. Go to leadtodaycommunity.com. That's leadtodaycommunity.com and sign up for Monday Moments. It's a weekly email that will encourage your leadership. Again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for telling a friend about the Today Counts show.